So let's get started. These are images of Detroit. And the story of Detroit is it used to be the fastest growing city in the world in the 1930s. Now it's the fastest declining city in the United States. The story of Detroit is not just about buildings. It's a story of broken homes, a story of lost property, of lost culture, and lost opportunities, lost education, and broken lives. The question I have is, does every complex problem, because we can all agree that Detroit is a very complex problem, does every complex problem have to have a complex solution? This is me when I was a little boy. When I was a little boy, I had a lisp. And I used to speak out of the side of my mouth when I made my S sound, a gap on the side of my mouth. And the public school system put me in speech therapy. So for a number of years in third grade and fourth grade, they would pull me out of class once or twice a week. I would go into a little room with the speech therapist, and I would practice making my S sounds, and she would show me flashcards, and she would model it for me, and she would make me say it, and it was very tedious, and it was very mentally painful and taxing for me, and I didn't like it, and I didn't want to do it, as you can imagine. When I was 12 years old, I got braces. Now, this is not my mouth, but and they put the bands on, and when they put the wire across my teeth, the very second that they put the wire through the bands, my lisp was corrected, because they closed the gap where I was making my S's. Okay, this taught me a very valuable lesson that stuck with me, which is that sometimes very complex problems can have very simple solutions. Now, it was many years after that I became familiar with the area of mathematics known as nonlinear mathematics. Some people would call it a new kind of science that's developed in the last several decades. And you may have heard of complexity theory. It's the study of very complex things like systems in biology, like the human brain, like ant colonies. And so the system, the complexity is comprised of patterns, really is what it's about. It's about seeing patterns in nature. There are patterns all around us. In fact, the brain has been attuned to seeing these patterns for thousands, if not millions of years. And these are some examples of them. I'm going to go through a couple of these just so you can see. These four patterns kind of look like trees. Most of us would say they look like trees. And the brain is tuned into these patterns, and I'm going to show you a lot more examples of these. This is a math professor, late Benoit Mandelbrot, who was at Yale University, who invented the theory of fractal geometry. And the fundamental precept of fractal geometry is somewhat complex, but it's the concept that simple shapes are what comprise these complex forms and patterns we see all throughout nature. So what nature does is it iterates and it replicates simple things. And what Mandelbrot did is he created, this is the Mandelbrot set, which is a pictorial representation of a mathematical algorithm that is explaining how nature creates these complex forms out of these simple things. And one of the key precepts of fractal geometry is something called self-similarity. And so it's very difficult to tell what scale something is on, because the same mathematical formulas apply whether you're dealing with something that's at a galactic scale or at a microscopic or subatomic scale. Because numbers are numbers, and so what they're doing is they're applying themselves and creating forms at all these different scales. So for instance, this is a CFAN, a couple feet across. This is a neuron, microscopic. This is a canopy of tree branches, and this is a network of neurons again. So we're going to go through several of these. And I coined a term in my book called fractal signatures. And what it is we kind of, the brain is, like I said, attuned to putting these into kind of categories or buckets. So you'll recognize as soon as we go through these that you'll see that these fractals come in different basic buckets. So we'll go through these pretty quickly. I used to teach kids this stuff, and I used to say, if you see stripes in the jungle, run. Okay, because what the brain has done over evolution has allowed us to see anomalies in what we're expecting to see. So if we're walking through the jungle and we see this kind of noise, the background, and we see a new pattern, that's what the brain is tuned to, picking up the new patterns, what's different. And so stripes is one of the common patterns that we see in nature. Now, within a fractal signature, each individual is unique, like a thumbprint. Each individual zebra is unique, but they all look like zebras. So we all know them by their fractal signature. These fractal signatures are more tentacle-like. Okay, but again, there's a scale issue. It's hard to tell. These are ice cracks on the surface of Europa, which is one of the moons of Jupiter. And it is about the size of the Earth. These are blood vessels in an eyeball. And these are tributaries of the River Ganges Delta in India. So we're going through a few more of these fractal patterns. This is the Eagle Nebula. The scale here is about 9.5 light years, which is about 50 trillion miles, which would take a spaceship about 1 billion years to fly from the top to the bottom. And that's all contained in the speck of the night sky. And I call this a billowing type of fractal. You probably guessed this is food coloring in water. So the same mathematical principles are at work, and you see these. This is a fractal of fluid dynamics. Everyone recognizes the great red spot on Jupiter. This is fluid dynamics on the surface of a soap bubble. This is an octopus tentacle. This is a tentacle created by the Mandelbrot set, mathematical representation. These are tentacles of subatomic particle collisions. You have wave fractals in the ocean. You have waves in the desert, waves in the sky. Each tree is its own fractal signature. So oak trees look different from pine trees, look different from palm trees. Mountains, a very distinct fractal signature. There's more mountains. More mountains. Now the difference between these mountains and these mountains is that these mountains were completely fabricated in a Hollywood studio using fractal geometry, using a computer application. And they basically did the same thing that we saw with the fern picture, in that they were taking small parts and replicating them and using massive amounts of processing to create these forms. That's what I call a cluster fractal. This is wildebeest. These are bees. A handful of coffee beans. This is a globular cluster. Hundreds of thousands of stars that orbit the Milky Way. Clusters of these exist out at the edges of the galaxy. These are rock formations, but the rock formation looks just like the enamel on your tooth. And a few more that you see the clusters that often show up in animal skins, bird feathers. You see the scatter patterns and the changing shapes, but you see the cluster, you see the scattered pattern. Spots on the cheetah. And this is actually an ant colony, and it is an aluminum casting of an ant colony. So they poured aluminum down into the colony to see the shape of the chambers that the ants are creating. And you can see that they create a fractal cluster fractal. So there are many, many different areas of this nonlinear science. One is called chaos theory, and the fundamental precept of chaos theory is the concept of amplification and feedback loops. Okay, the ants did a lot of feedback when they brought the chemical trails back. They lay down chemical trails, and they brought chemical messages back. Another area is fractal geometry. There's an area called emergence. Emergence is the best metaphor for emergence is the concept if you know what a hydrogen atom is and you know what an oxygen atom is, there's no way you can predict what the Atlantic Ocean is going to look like. So the idea is that as you add more and more component parts to the system becomes complex, but it also takes on new forms. It emerges. You get emergent forms. And there's a corollary to this called self-organized criticality. The idea that is sometimes there's another theory called calamity or catastrophe theory. These are points of inflection where the system will change and it's unpredictable. So the area of nonlinear math that I want to talk about most tonight is what's called dissipative structures far from equilibrium, which is a mouthful. Yeah. But it's often referred to as vortical flow structures. Okay, this is the brainchild of Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize in 1977, basically turning on its head 100 years of thermodynamics theory. And the concept being that Prigogine said that everything in the universe wants to organize itself, as opposed to disintegrating or moving towards entropy or moving towards heat death. Everything wants to cluster, it wants to coagulate. And so whether it's at a galactic scale or whether it's a hurricane will last 7 days, a galaxy will last billions of years, or whether it's a few seconds of the whirlpool in your bathtub when you pull the drain. Everything wants to organize itself. That's the nature of energy, and that was the primary concept that he was trying to show. Now, at the same time that all of this nonlinear math was being discovered, and this is only in the last several decades, and only because the computer was invented. Because until the computer, they had seen glimpses of this, but they weren't able to process enough data to find these patterns and to understand these patterns. So the concept of nonlinear mathematics is it doesn't lend itself to linear solutions. So what you and I learned in school, where it was x plus y equals z, nonlinear means there's too many variables. The only way to understand the weather is to use data points. And the more data points you have, the more computer processing you have, the better you're able to predict, and the better you're able to see. So all of these things developed in the last several decades with the computers as they emerged. And at the same time, scientists began understanding neuroscience a lot more in depth. And what they found was that the brain is comprised of literally hundreds of billions of neurons when you're born. You lose about half of them, so you end up with about 100 billion as an adult. And these neurons are all connected to each other. And like the ants, they're constantly sending out explosive. There are two types of impulses in the brain. One is called an excitatory impulse. The other is called an inhibitory impulse. So when you have a thought, you're sending out this explosive excitatory impulse of neurochemical and electrochemical activity. So there's electricity that passes down the neuron, and when it touches the other neuron, it changes to chemicals and neurotransmitters, and they cross. And this all happens in milliseconds. And so you create this explosion of electrochemical activity, and then you get a feedback of inhibitory neurons. So you've got information going back and forth through the neural pathways. And it's all a electrochemical and electromagnetic resonance that's sitting on top of the scaffolding of these hundreds of billions of neurons. And the hundreds of billions of neurons have over close to 4 quadrillion connections. So you're dealing with a complex system. So the neuroscientists began to see that the brain is in fact a complex system. And so they started applying the concepts of nonlinear mathematics to neuroscience and also to the social sciences. This book, Out of Control by Kevin Kelly, is what started me on this path, and he explores the concept of hive mind and the biology of machines and social systems. And he talks about this concept of distributed intelligence among insects. And you've got books like Nonlinear Dynamics in Mathematical Biology and Social Science, and Complexity Theory in the Social Sciences, Autopoiesis and Dissipative Structures and Spontaneous Social Orders, okay? complexity theory and the politics of education. So what they found was that all relationships, not only is an individual complex, not only is your biology, your body, your DNA, but also your brain is complex, but when you combine two people, then you essentially double the size of that complex relationship. But the relationship doesn't become more complex necessarily, it's still obeying the same mathematical principles. When you add a family, obviously you get exponentially more complexity. In corporations, you've got people at the core, and they're communicating, and they're working, and they're doing things, and they're sharing, and they're communicating between themselves internally, but also externally. You have nonprofit organizations, political organizations, geopolitical nation states, religious organizations. Okay, so the concept here is that every organization, every human organization, is now falls under this term called distributive social structures. Okay, and what I want to talk to you about, finish up here, is that the world is completely changing in front of us. Okay, with the advent of the internet, which is less than 20 years old from a practical standpoint, and the connectivity that is being created now, and the smartphones make all of us nodes on this giant connect. Sometimes people dismiss the social media applications. Social media applications are simply forms of communication that are riding on top of this interconnected network. And all they're doing is allowing people to create these feedback loops. And so what they're doing is they're allowing these excitatory impulses to burst out into the world, and then they're allowing them to fade or to have the inhibitory response and feedback come back. And that's what's happening. And some people are calling this the global brain. And I highly recommend this book as well. Howard Bloom is a fascinating author, and he talks about the way that bacteria and animals have connected in the way that we're connecting now. So the internet and all this global communication is allowing for self-organization. And self-organization in the form of meetup groups, gateways to volunteerism, people who are looking for opportunities to contribute to groups. Now you have things like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, which are crowdsourcing applications, crowdsourcing companies. They're allowing people to coagulate and accumulate money, which is essentially stored potential energy, and then direct that stored potential energy to a cause. So all of this is real world stuff, and that's what I want to kind of convey today, that everything in your life is social structure, distributive social structure. That your relationships, your family, your business, the organizations you belong to, and your community. So everything that you're involved in obeys these mathematical laws. And your children and your grandchildren are going to understand this far better than you and I can. They're going to understand this new language of nonlinear mathematics. It's going to pervade everything. And they're already participating in the dialogue. They're doing things sort of instinctively, and they're coagulating and they're organizing and they're doing these things that some of us are hesitant to do and are new to us, and we're clumsy at it, but they're already doing it. And the concept is that if you want to create a distributive social structure, you can do that as well. And if you give that structure the tools it needs, so if you give it connectivity, then that creates the opportunity for feedback loops. And that creates the opportunity for it to amplify and grow. And there's really unlimited amount of growth that a distributive structure can have, especially if the core is benevolent. If the cause is benevolent, then it can continue to grow and pull people into that structure and amplify through this now global network, using the language of communication, using English, for instance. It allows people to communicate more effectively across countries around the world. This is what we're doing at the American Youth Literacy Foundation. We're building a benevolent hurricane to resolve and reverse the literacy crisis in America and bring global literacy to children worldwide, and then bring global ESL, or Earth English, to 1 billion children around the world, all using these tools. But more so, as we move and understand these, we realize that you can apply these to solving some of the most complex problems of today. So, for instance, war, poverty, hunger, crime. So what I want to leave you with is that I'm incredibly optimistic about the future and the potential of distributive social structures. That we can understand ourselves and our social systems by learning to recognize the nonlinear patterns that are all around us and embedded in everything we do. And that we will transform our world through the compassionate use and harnessing and applying nonlinear mathematical principles to solving the social problems of tomorrow and today. Thank you very much.